are we feeling about Mod B? We'll talk about it in the chat. I like Mod B. I did T.S. Eliot. I don't know. I like Mod B. I'd actually put it straight after Common Mod, and sometimes I'm even like kind of in front of Common Mod. The only place I feel like it gets a bit is how heavy it is on form, but we'll look at that now. So, in terms of the module, it's the critical study, and that word critical is so important. And as we go through these slides, you'll see how big it is on just getting very deep into like the distinctive qualities of the text and like the textual integrity and its significance. It's very big on language, so the text specific language features and form. They express complex ideas and cohesively using appropriate register structure and modality, and then they draft, appraise, and refine their own text conventions of syntax, spelling, grammar. So this is literally a whole paragraph just on form and techniques and language. So techniques are so important to Mod B, and that is definitely the base of it. But otherwise, it's kind of just general. It's kind of like the context, meaning, and purpose. Perspective comes up and textual integrity comes up, but we're going to talk about that. So the key takeaways is that you're analyzing a substantial literary text in great depth to develop your interpretation. Your interpretation will be formed by having a solid understanding of the text construction, structure, and stylistic features. So that's where that form comes into play. And then textual integrity is what is the impact of the text? Does it portray any universal enduring values? What effect does it have on contemporary and contextual audiences? So textual integrity is such an important thing to come up with because, and you want that if you are going to try a base essay and you're going to memorize some statements, you want to have some statements memorized about textual integrity, because that's a lot of the time what the question is coming from, is the impact of the text, how it kind of endures value like over time. It's different to Mod A because you are only looking at one text, but in Mod B what you can do is say, okay, maybe this text was from the 1900s, but this is how it's still relevant today, and it can remind modern readers of this, which portrays its universal or like enduring value. Or you can even look at how like it might have been written then, but it can relate to like a time really back like hundreds of years before. And then does it have on contemporary and contextual audiences? So the contextual audience is the audience of that time, but you also want to look at how does it affect contemporary readers. So readers today, watchers today, the audience today, how does this text still affect us? Like, why are we studying it? Like if it wasn't relevant or we couldn't understand it today, why would we do it? That's really what that's about. So your job is to say, does your text have textual integrity? And spoiler, it wouldn't be on the HSC list if it didn't. And then to apply your personal interpretation of the text to concepts of textual integrity. Now, when it says personal interpretation, I feel like that gets confused a lot, and it is in the module, so it's always like, oh, like your interpretation of the text. And sometimes a question will even say using your interpretation. First of all, some people think to ever use first person, like I think this, I think that. This reminded me of, you are never using first person in anything but your Mod C reflection. That is the only time you will ever use that language. But your personal interpretation, don't think it has to be this super like unique and again philosophical thing like Common Mod and it's super out there. You can have a basic personal interpretation. Like that doesn't matter. It just matters that you interpret it, and that you can make those connections. So let's say like Eliot is talking about, I know in Hollow Men he's got a quote about idolship and how like they worship like false gods. You could make a link to the enduring value of that now and how highly our society puts celebrities and like TikTok influencers, social media influencers on a pedestal, for example, and they kind of like idolize sports people. And you could just make an example of that. And that's a personal interpretation, but that's not this really out there thought. That's something that a lot of people think, but you're making that interpretation between the two. So that's just an example of what to do. Now, they can give you different questions. These are some of them. Sometimes they, again, can give you an extract from the text, but if they do that, again, you can just refer to it once and they'll still have like a main question. To what extent does this statement, so you'd be saying the extent, this is also an extent question. But yeah, the questions can be super specific, which makes Mod B a bit harder to have a pre-prepared kind of base. I know for Mod B, writing a base essay and just having something that like you memorize and you draft is a bit more difficult, only because if it is like super specific or it is on a specific theme, like what are you going to do? But in that case, your quotes, technique, and evidence always stay the same. I know for T.S. Eliot, people really worry with having like an essay because they're like, what if it doesn't fit? Like how am I going to adapt it? But his poems will always mean the same thing. they always have the exact same context. The techniques always have the quotes always have the exact same techniques. Like, these things don't change. I don't want to sound repetitive on here, but I just feel like it's drilled so much into our heads, like, don't memorize, don't memorize, don't memorize. But there's so much in the essays that do stay the same. And for preparing, like, all your other subjects, not all of you guys, most of your other subjects, especially the humanities subjects, are memorizing. It's just memorizing content and then you're going in and applying it. And I feel like English is exactly the same, and that shouldn't be the advice, because realistically, like, you're doing all these practice responses in class, you're going to use the same quotes and the same techniques and the same evidence. But these are different questions that they can give you. Now, for critical analysis, there's a couple things, and this is where students do lose marks, is that they're just lacking the critical analysis, and that is what's stopping you from a band 6. So if you kind of scored like 15, 16 in your internal for mod B, a lot of it could have come from not doing these things. So highly sophisticated, in-depth analysis, they do really expect, especially for mod B, just really sophisticated, deep analysis. They really, really want it, because it is a critical analysis. So because it is critical, it needs to have that level of sophistication, and they do know that you've had it for at least a term. So there is that expectation that you know it in quite some depth. Personal interpretation of meaning is just, again, like that example I gave before, just like your own interpretation of what it means. And even though it's like personal interpretation, a lot of the time we're all just using like the Google interpretation, or like whatever our teacher like annotated on during reading or watching. The impact on the audience, and on audience you're doing contextual, which the audience at the time, but also the audience then, and then the judgment on the effectiveness of it. So how effective was it in impacting the audience back then and back now. Highly sophisticated analysis to achieve it. Identifying multiple techniques is a good thing. Identifying more difficult techniques, this goes against common mod, but realistically, like I just said, they know you've had the text for, and you've been studying it for at least a term. Some people have had it for even longer, and they did mod B earlier. So more difficult techniques are preferred. And then analyzing the use of form. For identifying multiple techniques, we've got this quote here, which has the repetition of Sundays, euphemism, the condescending tone, and then it's also an ironic juxtaposition. I'm not going to go in and put all 4 techniques, obviously, but pairing up techniques is such a good idea for mod B, only because it does sophisticate your analysis, and it does make it more critical in that sense, because it's clear that you're looking deeper into it. You're not like, oh, the repetition of, like, imagine I put this whole quote and I'm like, the repetition of Sunday, but I was like, instead I could say the repetition of Sunday paired with euphemism creates a sense of monotony and futility of lower class routines, and it just adds a bit more of that kind of critical factor. I don't know, I think of critical and it just sounds like they're just expecting more, like they just want a little bit more for mod B. And out of all the essays, mod B is where your language needs to be like peak and your techniques need to be peak. Like I know I said for common mod, like use tone, and it's not that you can't use tone, 100% it's here, but you don't want to be like reusing like really, really simple techniques over and over. The more complex your techniques are, and identifying more difficult ones is gonna make it more of a critical analysis. You want it to sound like really professional and really like enlightening, like really insightful, your mod B essay, because it is a critical analysis. So we've got the epigraphic illusion here, juxtaposition, the synecdoche. So there's so many different difficult techniques, but the thing is, because you can prepare your quotes, you can also prepare your techniques. So get that ready in advance. And these are some other like anaphoras, hyperboles, enjambment, oxymorons, like just some of those higher level techniques are definitely preferred in mod B. And then analyzing the use of form is always going to do you justice. So you don't have to like have multiple techniques for every quote, or like have super complex techniques for every single quote, but having like a mix of these 3 things is really going to work. And these are just some examples of how you can analyze form and use form and link to form, because a lot of the time form comes up in questions, and form has a lot to do. Form and structure also go hand in hand. So if you're struggling writing about form, you can always just tie it back to structure. So if we were looking at how does the author reflect on the nature of language, you can say that they subvert traditions and conventions. They've got authorial intrusion. They discuss writing or language. Language comes up a lot in questions. So I just feel like having a sophisticated analysis, you'll be ready in case you do get the question on language, because your actual evidence and analysis is answering it subconsciously. Then your personal interpretation and judgment on effectiveness is going to come from the concepts, language, and form kind of interconnecting. So it can contend with human fallibility, it can probe universal truths, it can encapsulate a time period, it can reveal something about the human experience. It's all going to be different depending on your text. But you do just want to kind of have that kind of judgment on the effectiveness of the text. And then, like I was saying, we've got audience impact and contextual versus contemporary responders. So the contextual is the influence of the context on the composition of the text, the reception of the text in that time period, and how the text argues with contextual values. Sometimes it will agree, but a lot of the times the texts are going against the contextual values of the time to kind of teach the context or warn the context of a certain message or meaning. And then there are the contemporary responders, which is how the message is endured. It questions their values, it critiques the outmoded literary conventions, and then it can also allow us to reflect on our identity and our values and our morals. So this is a sample analysis from Rhapsody on a Windy Night, which is T.S. Eliot. So the disorientation of the individual in 20th century mass culture is embodied by the self-effacing narrator of Rhapsody on a Windy Night, whose lack of agency is parodied by the personification of the lamps. This is another example where you can have the technique before the quote, and then you've got the analysis after it. And here they've got commanding tone and truncated lines bitterly satirizes human subjugation to routines and machinery. Such a concern resonates equally with contemporary anguish over individual agency. So here you can already see that they've got multiple techniques. So they're pairing up the techniques. They've got the truncated lines, but also the personification. And then they're also doing that enduring value and showing like how it resonates with the contemporary and like our current audience. But they've also got the context. So this is like, I'd say, very strong exemplar, only because it does all those things, but it doesn't seem, I feel like when you look at these slides and you're like, oh my gosh, I have to do all these things, it seems like a lot, but this is just like 3-4 sentences and it's doing all of it really nicely. So I definitely recommend just having a look at this and just kind of using this as a guide, that you're going to talk about context, you're going to pair up some techniques, you're going to make a link and have that personal interpretation. That personal interpretation is here. So a lot of the time your personal interpretation will be when you make connections to the contemporary context of today. So when you're integrating scholars, it's up to you guys if you want to do it. You don't have to, and you still can 100% score a band 6 without doing it. I know in my internal I didn't use one. And I got 19. So you don't need a scholar, but it will enhance your analysis. So it's up to you. If you do want to add it, I wouldn't honestly do it more than once. Add a max twice, because it's, again, the module itself is a lot about your interpretation, and the module doesn't require a scholar. It's just one of those things. And if you guys haven't ever heard of it, what a lot of band 6 students will do, they'll go find like a critic comment on their text that is just going to back up their argument. So maybe they made an argument, or they've got the personal interpretation that the agency of machinery mimics our lack of individual agency to technology today, or to artificial intelligence today, for example. And then they'll go and find a scholar who also agrees with that statement, and they'll say, this is supported by critic blah blah who commented, and then have the quote. So first of all, it's not necessary. I did it in my HSC and I just had one, but it's just to support your point. It's not to bring up a new point. It's not to argue your point. It's literally just like, oh, I think this, here's proof that it's true. And you're pulling out a critic. But guys, it's not necessary. I don't think you need to do it at all. It can just add that kind of critical element though. And it does sophisticate your analysis. So if you are going to do it, skim read for concepts, summarize critical readings into a few key dot points, and pull out succinct quotes, like just really simple quote. Again, don't do more than 2, but if you are going to do it, 1 is perfectly fine. They're not expecting it. It's not actually in the module. It's just something like just a step up, to kind of step up your writing. And you can paraphrase them to support your point. But getting bogged down in details and academic jargon, like you don't need to say like this critic like was born in Pennsylvania and studied at the university. Like, they don't care. Like, we don't need it. You don't want to spend too much time looking into the reading. Like, it's just such a little thing. Like, it does add to your writing, but it's not going to make your whole writing. Like, you're not going to have a 12 out of 20 essay, and then you add in a critic quote, and your mark is like, you know what, full marks, because you put in a critic quote. Like, it's not like that. You don't want to pull out quotes longer than a sentence, because you just want like a really simple, like, oh, this critic also like supports this statement, or supports this meaning, or supports this interpretation of the text. Like, that's literally all it is. It's nothing deeper. Do not overanalyze it. Like, that should be a part of your, when you have your quote technique and analysis, that shouldn't be like a whole separate quote that you're going to analyze. That's to back up your own quotes and evidence. So that's integrating scholars. Again, not necessary. We'll talk about it in the live chat if you guys are planning on doing it or not. It's just something to add to it. I did it for HSC because I was like, oh, I feel like it'll sophisticate it, but really, I don't know if it made a difference. I don't know if it made much of a difference, because my analysis was still the same. It just backed up a point. So it's just something extra that you can do if you do have the time to fit it in as well. There's no point. If you cannot finish writing your Mod B practice in 40 minutes, don't add a scholar, because it's not necessary. You don't have to. It's just one of those extra things. And now we're going to talk about writing with flair, which is all about having an opinion, adapting structure, clearing clever expression, unique analysis, critiquing your text, analysis that flows, introducing rebuttals, varied sentences, and specific verbs and figurative language. All these things are going to help your text just have flair, and then that flair will help it sound more like a critical analysis. So having an opinion is literally just your personal interpretation, but having that personal voice can come through your writing. So ask yourself, do you like the text? Is it well made or written? Or does its ideas have values? I know for Mod B, like, I'm never going to sit here and be like, yeah, I loved studying this text, but I did like studying, even though T.S. Eliot is very repetitive, and I think Preludes, Rhapsody, and Love Song are so similar. I actually did like studying text because I thought the meaning was pretty interesting compared to some of the other texts I've done. And even Crucible, like, the plot low-key goes hard. The plot is like at it. Abigail is such a gaslighter, but having an opinion can help your writing, and you are the audience. So when you say like, oh, this challenges the audience perspective, of think to yourself, like, when reading this text, did it make me think twice about this? Did it make me reconsider my value on on religion or faith for Eliot, for example, or on meaning or identity? And you can use that thought as analysis and just say, which allows audience to reconsider their presumed beliefs on this. So that's important, and you are the audience. So if you're not really sure how to make an audience connection, remember that you're the audience, and you can, especially for the contemporary audience, like, that's literally you, and you can literally just bring in your own opinion. Structure and varying it, again, it's not a rigid thing, so you can adapt it. You don't need to. But the purpose of structure is to direct your margo throughout your argument. So you can switch up your peel structure. Obviously, you still want to start with like your point and link, but you can kind of mix explanation and evidence together and kind of like intertwine them. Or you can vary how you introduce quotes. Like, that's what I was saying before. Like, start with your technique and then bring in the quote, or kind of explain the setting a bit and then bring in the quote, then technique. Like, up to you how you do it, but just varying it so it's not always like, this is the quote, this is the technique, this is the analysis, this is the next quote, this is the quote. Like, you don't want to sound like that, and varying it will have more of a personal voice and just give your writing a little bit more flair. And then you can use a quote from a critic or writer in your intro if you wanted to. So like, if you had a quote that, like, maybe Eliot was one of the most famous modernist poets of his time, which he was, but if you could find like a critic quote and you put that in your intro, that's just something to mix it up. But experimenting with structure is definitely recommended. Clearing clever expression is important. Short sentences is important. In English, I remember in year 10, one of my teachers went through my essay and she like highlighted how many lines one of my sentences was, because it was so long. It was so long. And I feel like in English, you don't even realize how, because you're actively thinking and like actively answering and like writing it, it's such a different world that you're in your head, like when you're sitting in English exam and writing an essay. But it's so easy to write these super long sentences that like you end up using and like a million commas, and like you don't even, like, you forget halfway what you're even saying. So short sentences are the trick. That doesn't mean like write a one line sentence, but a lot of the time I feel like short sentences seem so simple and seem so basic, so I try to do these like really long complicated sentences and make all these links, try to do it all in one, but it actually makes my work less concise. It makes it heavier. So expanding your vocabulary is very important, and I've got some stuff to help you guys with that. So eradicating the word shows from your essay vocab. I don't want to. None of you, none of you are using the word shows. We're gonna be using these words, and I actually made a like a slideshow that you guys can screenshot, just like images if you want, or like take a photo of, which has words instead of shows. You're not allowed to use shows. You're all banned. You're all banned. No one is using the word shows. Clear and clever expression, which you can do through using figurative language. So a lot of people think like figurative language and writing kind of in that metaphorical, with that metaphorical flair, is purely for creative writing, but it's not. You can write like that in your essays too. So we've got like mirroring his surrogate Prospero, Shakespeare conjures the striking image, Pacino sanctified by the limelight of Hollywood. Lines like that, they sound so good, but it's still analysis, but they sound so figurative, and that's because it's that really clear and kind of clever expression. So I think opening it up with that is such a powerful thing, and just metaphorically using language, even though it's an essay. I never used to do that because I was like, it's an essay. Like if I wanted to write with figurative language, like I'll do that in a creative, but it definitely adds that kind of flair to your work. This is what I was talking about. I didn't realize I put it here. And if you're not following our TikTok, I'm gonna plug. No, these are all, you can save them straight off our TikTok, but you can also screenshot them. But I'm trying to post like a lot of stuff like this just to help you guys out on there if you wanted to follow, but you don't have to. This is just some words that you can say instead of shows. I think I use like conveys and demonstrates like to death every single time. I overdo it so much. But these are some other words instead of shows. So I don't want to hear any excuses. Memorize a couple and then go on a little bit of a cycle, like a little bit of a hamster wheel, and it's like, which one am I going to use today? These are some other ones instead of to conclude. And then you could also use words like ultimately, overall, and thus, definitively, consequently, in summation, as your linking sentences for your paragraph. So let's switch it up. For comparative, which is so important for mod A, these are the words you want to use, and these are the words that the phrases that you want to start with when you're going back and forth between your quotes. And that makes sure, like, it is impossible if you do this to not talk about the textual conversation, because you're literally you're bringing up your second quote in reference to your first by starting with the similarities or differences. So naturally you have to follow on and explain that. So you just gaslight yourself into answering the question. And then instead of but, you can use these words. These are just some examples. Obviously there's more, but language makes such a difference. And like I said, mod B is so much bigger, and you guys can see how much they care about sophistication and analysis and form. So the more sophisticated, I feel like I don't want to say like the smarter your essay sounds, but seriously, the smarter your essay sounds, let me disclaimer this. You don't want to like pull out, those people who just use the most outrageous like synonym.com, like literally sound like synonym.com when they talk like words, and it doesn't even make sense because they're using so many big words that it doesn't make sense. Obviously not, but mixing a couple like kind of strong higher vocab words with lines like this, it just chef's kiss.